I don't know if anyone's really noticed, but there's this weird trend lately of making every important character in video games, movies, or TV shows strangely too good for their own good. There's mentions of this weird trend every so often whenever there's discussions online, be it on Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, and whatnot. But I feel like there's a lack of concrete definitions to explain why almost every character in popular media feels too perfect. The origins of character creation aren't that difficult to explain. It all began with role-playing games, in particular Dungeons and Dragons, where people were required to create their own persona to go on adventures, which eventually led to creating charts as a starting point to define your character's personality to speed up and ease the process. And why was this important? Well, it was something that eventually went beyond the realm of fantasy and fiction. The character alignment chart has been a subject of discussion in academia, where it's mostly dismissed as an immature representation of the world and something that shouldn't be used to represent people in general. What I think academics fail to realize is how the character alignment chart doesn't really represent what people are, but rather how they want to be ideally perceived. Everyone in general doesn't think about any of the complex charts these psychologists like to use to define themselves on a daily basis. Generally speaking, people under social pressure situations have a very simplistic definition of themselves, with the goal of appealing to a wide range of strangers because they just want to be liked and respected in public. Or in other words, when in doubt, everyone wants to be the lawful good character. It's the safest and most plain personality anyone can have. A people pleaser, if you like. No matter how much they try to dismiss it, something simple and easy to recognize is what people really use every day one way or another to portray themselves positively to the world, especially in 2023 where everybody wants to be defined desperately into one category or another. So what happens when these types of people trying to escape reality, living under social pressure and desperate to fit in become writers, who then get hired by corporations also desperate to understand younger generations, start creating fictional characters that are reflections of how they want to be seen? You get a pandemic of lawful good characters used by these companies to promote political and moral ideals for their own benefit. So, characters designed to stand up against the mundane, like the patriarchy or some bullshit social movement, instead of things that have real weight in the real world. This only shows how shallow and immature these people's views are. There's nothing wrong with reaching a moral conclusion within a fictional story, but as an advice, don't try mixing them up with current real-world events. Real life isn't that simple, so it's usually best to work within the limits you establish in your own fiction. On that note, this also applies to mixing your publicity stunts to real-world activism. You can't win in this scenario. Somehow, somewhere, at some point, you're just gonna look like a hypocrite. Preaching to the average person only kills the medium of entertainment in itself. It no longer becomes a form of escapism, and it exhausts the viewer instead for how boring and self-righteous they can be. But do companies listen? No, not even after losing ridiculous amounts of money. Instead, they use these band-aid solutions to these hemorrhagic problems, such as their characters in this social movement propaganda masqueraded as films or TV shows, always having certain things in common. One of them being how nothing really works with common sense whenever they are around. No one stops them in their tracks if they say something objectively wrong, stupid, or out of line, and their actions are always justified somehow. And what's worse, everyone around them just accepts all of it without question. They make them the center of the universe. These stories demand a suspension of these beliefs so great that only a moron consumer could take in without the word of complaint. It's a Naked King type of scenario where we all have to suspend our sense of disbelief for fear of becoming social outcasts to pretend the lawful good heroes are just funny, quirky, and likable, when in reality they are all annoying pieces of shit who bring or say nothing of value. When put into perspective, these stories are simply insults to the audience's intelligence, but it just doesn't click when there's explosions, lasers, superpowers, or whatever key jingling people fall for these days. Personally, I believe following this type of popular media leads to a worse type of society, because no one can be objectively critical about anything without fear of being reprimanded by the morons that are already too emotionally invested. That is, the people that have already fallen for every brainwashing propaganda these marketing campaigns have under their sleeves. They want to create a type of tribalistic mindset where everyone will start defending the products and characters these corporations produce with sheer idolatry. Speaking against them makes you a target, equivalent to a heretic in their followers' eyes, that deserves nothing short of either the death penalty or at the very least a really shitty rest of your life. Because that's what these companies have in mind: emotional manipulation. None of this makes any sense in theory. So let me briefly explain it this way. You see, there's always been a considerable amount of individuals in populations that are inclined to develop certain types of fanatic behavior. Hundreds of years ago, these types of people would have been recluses in a monastery up in the mountains, reading and translating biblical texts from morning to night, being told by a head priest what to do, when, and where. But in our modern times, with the degradation of religion in the West and the lack of a common cultural narrative, people turn their obsessive fanatic tendencies to many different types of urban tribes, corporations, and consumer culture instead, in an attempt to satisfy their intrinsic spiritual needs. After all, there's not that much difference between a cult and a fanbase. We gather together simply to discuss a single point of narrative from different perspectives. Only that the internet has completely changed the game. That is, the marketing of products and the trending of them. Corporations no longer try to win over the consumer with quality products, but also with the false promise of a lifestyle that you can share with friends or strangers online. You can even hear traditional financial terms being tossed around whenever there's a new product coming out, like FOMO, which is fear of missing out. They are not even trying to hide the engineering process that goes behind the marketing to get people hooked up. And in the middle of all this chaos is where these lawful good characters come to the spotlight. Traditionally, in all kinds of religions, the main characters could be defined under the umbrella of the lawful good protagonist, featuring in stories where under no circumstances could their words or actions be questioned. Whatever they say goes, whatever they do is sacred. The people around them simply followers, yes men and women wishing they could be like them, sometimes to the point of jealousy. Every type of popular media is in a way trying to create their own perfect ideal represented in one individual. I will argue the obsession with the lawful good main character lies with the core intention of trying to create a proxy messiah, a perfect figurehead pushing a product to idealize that you can't really put into question, not unless you want to be labeled an unbeliever and suffer social rejection by an angry mob trying to cancel you. If the goal of corporations is to create an idealizing fanbase, aka a cult, it makes sense to build perfect main characters that embody every trait a follower or fanatic will want to see in themselves to the public, that is, the ideal self. It's a type of indoctrination as old as time, since you really can't question perfection if everyone agrees on what that means, and producers in Hollywood definitely know better than you or me what that definition should be. It also gives the creators, that is the writers, directors, and producers, the chance to label themselves every single positive personality trait given to these central fictional figures without having to do anything meaningful. That's why Disney has had such an easy time mixing their fictional media with politics. It's not the first time fictional propaganda is used in such a way to mold our social structures. Roman political figures used to embellish every victory or defeat to make the empire look better in the public eye. And pretty much all religious books are centered around the idea of how to live live a perfect life or construct a proper, perfect utopia with the premise of having a higher divine power willing us to do so. But supernatural stories have been around us way longer than the Roman Empire, the Bible, the Quran, or whatever religion prevails to this day. And we know this because, thankfully, we have records of ancient myths like from Greek mythology. The Greeks loved stories, especially the ones that involved the supernatural and the divine. But it didn't take them long to figure out how all of these stories, dwelling on the nature of perfection, had really shitty narratives and even worse life lessons to draw from. Perfection being the opposite of what it is to be human. Someone that believes themselves perfect has no room for improvement and therefore has no other fate in life other than falling for the trap that is egotism and other antisocial behaviors. Uncontrolled self-love is no different than suicide. One of the solutions the Greeks found was distancing themselves from the image of perfection and started being self-critical instead, reaching towards different forms of ego death. This led to the attribution of many human characteristics and flaws to their own pantheon of gods and demigods. Zeus was a womanizer. Hera was an unreasonable and jealous wife, often punishing mortals and lesser gods alike. The hero Achilles was cursed by Apollo after desecrating temples and traditions, and the hunter Orion was murdered by Gaia for his hubris. This turned stories that were meant to be ideals to aspire to cautionary tales, often involving human nature struggling against itself and its own vanity, like the tale of King Midas, who wished nothing more than being rich, gaining the power to turn everything he touched into gold, only to end up killing his own family by mistake and starving to death. Or the story of Narcissus, a handsome young boy that went around breaking hearts, being cursed by the goddess of love Aphrodite into falling in love with himself and drowning in a lake after staring at his own reflection. Essentially, Greek mythology broke off from the ideal stereotype of a lawful good character and introduced what we know as the anti-hero, an individual with real flaws and negative personality traits that still try doing good in their own unique ways. So, a regular human being. These types of self-contradicting characters, often mistreated by the world around them, never fails to attract people's attention. There's something about them, you never know what they're gonna do next. And usually nothing works out their way, but they still try moving forwards. They are not ideals, but a real reflection of who we are or can be, whether it's at our lowest or highest. Escapism might be dying, but one of the remedies could be characters that are more human than divine or perfect. Truth is, this pandemic of lawful good characters is at the end of its cycle. Everything's a trend, so it won't take long for things to start gradually shifting. The real question is, are these corporations ready? I don't think so. My personal guess is they'll most likely keep doubling down, creating more perfectly boring characters and ideals no one wants to see. So long as there's BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, politicians running for elections, and other criminals trying to launder their money, these endless attempts at social engineering through popular media won't stop. At least, not anytime soon. The silver lining is, all of this leaves a lot of space open for independent creators such as myself to fill in those blanks with alternative media. I was so tired, and still am, of seeing so much mediocre bullshit trying to pass as something deep and complex that I just began writing my own book. Hopefully it will be done someday, soon. But I promise I'll do my best at being relatable and entertaining, as good fiction should be. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Bye.